Ethan was not going to attack Julian, he was simply going to stop holding him up. Without Ethan's silent support, the great Julian would vanish like a mirage. Ethan thanked Mr. Sterling, declined the offer of a chauffeur, and walked back to his old car. The weight in his pocket was gone, but the weight in his heart had finally lifted. The secret was no longer a burden. It was the key to a door Julian did not even know was locked. The afternoon sun hung low and orange over the skeletal frame of the Evergreen project. This was the groundbreaking completion ceremony, a high-stakes media event where the first smart brick would be laid by Julian himself. Dozens of cameras were lined up, their lenses pointed at a velvet-covered podium. The mayor was there, the city's elite were there, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh concrete and political ambition. Julian was in peak form, wearing a custom-tailored hard hat that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. He was shaking hands, laughing, and pointing at the soaring steel beams as if he had welded them himself. Ethan arrived late, blending into the crowd of construction workers and engineers at the back of the site. He wore a high-visibility vest and a plain white hard hat, looking exactly like the nobody Julian expected him to be. He watched from behind a stack of lumber as Julian took the stage. The tension in Ethan's chest was like a coiled spring. He was not nervous for himself, he was nervous for the truth. He watched Julian lean into the microphone, his voice amplified across the construction site. "This project is my heart," Julian proclaimed, his hand over his chest. "I spent nights staring at these beams, calculating the wind loads, dreaming of how to give this city a future." In the back, a few of the actual site foremen exchanged glances. They knew who had really been there at 3-toe and checking the concrete pours. They knew who had answered their frantic calls when the soil samples came back unstable. They knew it was not the man in the $5,000 suit. The tension began to ripple through the crowd like a slow-moving wave. Mr. Sterling stood at the edge of the stage, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Julian with a predatory stillness. He held a tablet in his hand, connected to the building's central nervous system, a system that was currently dormant, waiting for a command that Julian did not possess. "Before we lay the ceremonial brick," Mr. Sterling's voice cut through Julian's speech, "I would like to demonstrate the auto-regulating atrium that you have touted in all the brochures, Julian. The press is eager to see the roof pedals open for the first time. It is a masterpiece of your engineering, after all." Julian's smile faltered for a microsecond. He turned to his head of operations, a man who usually delegated everything to Ethan. The head of operations looked around frantically for Ethan, but Ethan was standing behind a pillar, his phone turned off, his hands in his pockets. "Of course, Mr. Sterling," Julian said, regaining his composure. "It is a simple override. Max, get the interface ready." Max, the associate, tapped at a laptop connected to the podium, but the screen flashed a deep, uncompromising red. "Access denied. Creative director's signature required." Julian laughed it off, though a bead of sweat was beginning to trace a path down his temple. "Technical glitch. Give us a moment." He leaned over and hissed at Max, "Where is Ethan? Find that kid and get him up here now." But Ethan did not move. He watched as the press began to murmur. He watched as the mayor checked his watch. The tension was no longer a secret. It was a visible crack in Julian's armor. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, his voice loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Julian, surely the man who designed the system knows the override code. It is based on the Fibonacci sequence of the structural ribs. Your own design, right?" Julian stared at the screen, the numbers and variables looking like an alien language to him. He was a man who had spent his life skipping the photos of the process. And now, in the most important photo of his life, the process was exposing him as an intruder. The secret was bubbling to the surface. And as Julian looked out into the crowd, His eyes finally landed on Ethan, the man he had shoved into the shadows just 24 hours ago. For the first time, Julian did not see a valet. He saw the only person who could save him, and he saw that the invisible man was finally choosing to stay invisible. The silence at the construction site was no longer expectant. It was suffocating. The mayor leaned in, whispering something to his aide, while the red access denied light on the podium screen pulsed like a heartbeat. Julian looked out into the sea of cameras, his face a mask of sweating arrogance. He saw Ethan standing near the back, leaning against a steel girder, his arms crossed. For the first time, Julian did not see a valet or catering staff. He saw the only man who held the keys to his kingdom. Ethan. Julian's voice cracked over the open mic, a desperate, loud command that betrayed his panic. Ethan, get up here and fix this terminal. Now. The crowd turned. The cameras followed Julian's frantic gaze to the man in the high-visibility vest. Ethan did not rush. He did not scramble to save his boss. He walked toward the stage with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had already reached the finish line. As he climbed the stairs, the security guard, the same one who had ignored him at the gala, stepped aside without a word. Ethan reached the podium and looked at the screen, then at Julian. The override code is not a glitch, Julian, Ethan said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying clearly through the microphones. It is a signature. The system is asking for the creative director's biometric and digital key. Since you told the press this was your heart and your calculation, it should open for you. Julian hissed under his breath, his eyes darting to the journalists. Do not play games, kid. Open the roof. I will double your salary. I will give you a senior associate title tomorrow. I do not want a title from a man who does not know the difference between a load-bearing beam and a decorative pillar, Ethan replied. He turned to Mr. Sterling, who was watching with a sharp, knowing smile. Mr. Sterling, the Evergreen Project was built on a promise of integrity. If the foundation is a lie, the building will not stand. I cannot provide the key to a man who did not draw a single line of these blueprints. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave. The secret was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, taking the microphone. It seems we have a discrepancy. Julian, if you are the architect, why does the United States Patent Office list Ethan Thorne as the sole inventor of the carbon capture concrete and the atrium dynamics used here? And why, Sterling paused, holding up his tablet for the cameras to see, does the original metadata for every single file in this project originate from a private server in a small attic apartment 3 miles from here? Julian's world collapsed in real time. The visionary of the year looked small, his custom hard hat slipping slightly as he stepped back from the podium. The press descended like a storm, flashbulbs exploding, but this time the photos were not for a wall of honor. They were for the front page of a scandal. Julian tried to push through the crowd, but there was nowhere to go. He had built his reputation on a stage of glass, and Ethan had finally let the hammer fall. 6 months later, the atmosphere at the Evergreen Project was unrecognizable. There were no velvet ropes, no chilled champagne, and no men in $5,000 suits claiming credit for the work of others. The first building was complete, its smart bricks glowing softly in the twilight, absorbing the city's carbon and breathing out clean air. Ethan stood in the courtyard, watching a group of children from the local neighborhood run through the communal gardens. He was not the secret architect anymore. He was the director of the Thorne Foundation, an independent body established by Mr. Sterling to ensure that the project remained true to its halal and moral roots, prioritizing people over profit. As for Julian, the poetic justice had been absolute. He was not in prison, but in the world of high-end architecture, he was a ghost. His firm had folded under the weight of lawsuits and revoked licenses. He was a man who lived for the photo, and now no one wanted to be in a frame with him. He had learned the hard way that you can steal a man's sketches, but you can never steal his genius. The final scene of the video captures a moment of quiet symmetry. A local journalist approaches Ethan for a final photo to commemorate the opening. "Mr. Thorne, please, stand in the center. We need the mastermind in the shot." Ethan looks at the journalist, then at the group of construction workers who were still on site, the teachers who were moving into the new apartments, and the young apprentices he had hired to learn the craft. He reaches out, pulling them all into the circle. "In this project," Ethan says, looking directly into the camera with a humble, steady smile, "there is no mastermind. There is only the truth of what we build together." The shutter clicks. The flash is bright and clear. This time, Ethan is not pushed out of the frame. He is exactly where he belongs, not as a king on a throne of lies, but as a pillar of a community built on the truth. The screen fades to black with a final quote: "Truth is the only foundation that never cracks." The rain began as a fine mist, clinging to the cold marble pillars of the grand Sterling ballroom like a shroud. Inside, the air was a pressurized chamber of ambition, smelling of expensive oud and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. Ethan stood at the periphery of the gala, his presence as quiet as the shadows he inhabited. He wore a charcoal blazer that had seen better days, its fabric clean, but lacking the razor-sharp sheen of the Italian wool surrounding him. For 3 years, Ethan had lived in the Evergreen Project, a blueprint designed not for profit, but for the dignity of the displaced. He had breathed life into every structural beam and solar pane on those digital pages, working as a nameless consultant for Julian's prestigious firm. He was not there for the accolades. He was there because he believed that today, his silent contribution to the city's skyline would finally be anchored in reality. He felt the weight of a small, encrypted flash drive in his pocket, a silent witness to a truth no one in this room was prepared to hear. The ballroom floor was a chessboard of power, and Julian was moving like a king who owned every square. Julian's laugh was a practiced, booming sound that commanded the attention of every socialite and city official within earshot. He moved toward the Wall of Honor, a massive backdrop where the city's elite gathered for the commemorative press photos. Behind him, a trail of junior associates followed like hungry wolves, mimicking his posture and his arrogance. As the photographer began shouting instructions to tighten the grouping, Ethan was swept forward by the momentum of the crowd. He found himself standing near the edge of the frame, his calm, weathered face a stark contrast to the Botox smiles of the executives. The photographer nodded at him, sensing the quiet authority in Ethan's eyes, but before the shutter could click, the atmosphere shifted. Julian's hand, heavy and clad in a gold-linked cuff, slammed into Ethan's shoulder. It was not a nudge, it was a dismissal. Julian shoved Ethan back with a casual cruelty that suggested he was not even worth the effort of an apology. "Wait a second," Julian sneered, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a blade. The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a public execution. Julian looked Ethan up and down, lingering on his scuffed leather shoes and the lack of a silk tie. "I think there has been a mistake. This photo is for the architects of the future, the men who actually build things, not the valet service. Did you get lost looking for the coat check, or are you here to empty the trash?" A ripple of cruel, sycophantic laughter erupted from Julian's circle. They did not see a man, they saw a barrier to their perfect image. Ethan did not stagger, though the force of the shove had been significant. He planted his feet and met Julian's gaze with a clarity that was unnerving. He did not shout. He did not reach for his invitation. He simply stood his ground, his English calm and measured. "I was invited to be in this photo because I am part of this project." Ethan said, his voice low but carrying a frequency that demanded to be heard. But Julian only stepped closer, invading Ethan's personal space until the scent of expensive scotch was overwhelming. "Listen to me, you insignificant ghost," Julian hissed, leaning in so only Ethan could feel the heat of his words. "In this world, there are creators and there are spectators. You look like a man who has spent his life watching from the sidelines. You do not have the look, you do not have the pedigree, and you certainly do not have the right to stand in my light. Get out of the frame before I have security drag you out in front of the cameras." Julian turned his back, physically erasing Ethan from the space. He signaled the photographer, who, intimidated by Julian's influence, looked away from Ethan and raised his camera. The flashbulbs exploded in a rhythmic, blinding strobe, capturing Julian in a pose of triumphant leadership. Ethan stood 5 feet away, cast into the literal and metaphorical darkness of the hallway. To the onlookers, he was a humiliated nobody, a man who had tried to social climb and failed. But as the spots cleared from Ethan's eyes, he felt a strange sense of liberation. The humiliation was the final seal on the contract of Julian's downfall. Julian had just publicly claimed a throne built entirely on Ethan's stolen labor, and the photo he was so desperate to be in would soon become the evidence of his greatest fraud. Ethan adjusted his blazer, his heartbeat slow and steady, knowing that the secret in his pocket was about to turn this night of vanity into a day of reckoning. The drive home from the gala was a journey through a different city than the one Julian saw from his penthouse. Ethan steered his aging sedan through the rain-slick streets of the industrial district, where the neon signs flickered like dying stars and the high-rises gave way to cramped tenements. He pulled up to a weathered brick building, climbing 3 flights of creaking stairs to the attic apartment that served as his sanctuary and his laboratory. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, cold coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar shavings from his drafting pencils. This was the womb of the Evergreen Project. While the world slept, Ethan had spent 3 years here, hunched over a scarred oak table that had belonged to his father, a man who had taught him that an architect's true client is not the one with the checkbook, but the one who will call the building home. The struggle had not started with a blueprint. It had started with a promise. Ethan remembered his father, a master mason whose hands were maps of scars and grit, standing in the ruins of a collapsed tenement years ago. "A house without a soul is just a cage," Ethan, his father, had said, his English thick with the effort of a self-taught man. "Build something that breathes." Those words had become Ethan's compass. When he graduated at the top of his class, he realized the corporate firms did not want buildings that breathed. They wanted glass towers that screamed of wealth. He had been rejected by every major firm for being too idealistic or lacking the social pedigree required for high-end commissions. He was a man with a genius-level understanding of structural load-bearing and thermal dynamics, yet he was treated as a ghost because he did not play the game of optics. His entry into Julian's world had been a desperate necessity. 2 years ago, struggling to keep the lights on, Ethan had entered an anonymous design competition under the pseudonym The Silent Architect. His submission for a sustainable urban hub was so advanced, so mathematically perfect, that it caught the eye of Julian's senior scouts. They did not know who he was, and Julian did not care. They tracked him down and offered him a consultancy role, a fancy term for a ghostwriter. They paid him enough to survive, but the contract was a cage of non-disclosure agreements. Julian had looked at Ethan's initial sketches for the Evergreen Project and seen dollar signs. Ethan had seen a way to give 1,000 families a garden in the sky. Every night for 18 months, the routine was the same. Ethan would receive a cold, clinical email from Julian's office demanding more flair or cheaper materials. Ethan would respond with calculations that proved Julian's suggestions would compromise the safety of the residents. He fought for every inch of the foundation, every pane of solar reactive glass, and every communal courtyard. He was the one who calculated the load dynamics for the massive central atrium, ensuring that the structure could withstand the city's harshest winds while remaining light and airy. Julian could not even explain what those variables meant, yet he was the one signing the press releases. Ethan's secret was born in this friction, the realization that Julian was selling a brand, while Ethan was building a legacy. The true turning point, the moment the secret became a plan, happened 6 months ago. Ethan was reviewing the final patent filings for the project's proprietary carbon capture concrete, an invention of his own making. He discovered a loophole in the standard consultancy agreement Julian's legal team had used. They had assumed Ethan was an employee, but his status as an independent strategic vendor meant that the intellectual property for any unsolicited innovations remained with the creator until a formal transfer of title was signed. Julian, in his haste to claim the glory, had never bothered to finalize that transfer. He was so convinced that Ethan was a nobody who would be grateful for the crumbs of a paycheck that he had not noticed he was building his entire reputation on a foundation he did not legally own. Ethan had spent his last bit of savings hiring a quiet, sharp-eyed intellectual property lawyer. They did not sue. They did not scream. They simply registered the patents in Ethan's name and waited. Ethan continued to work, continued to take Julian's insults in the office, and continued to let the world believe he was just a valet of the drafting board. He bore the humiliation of being ignored at meetings and being sent to fetch coffee while Julian presented Ethan's work to the mayor. He bore it because he knew that the truth is a slow-growing tree, but its roots are unbreakable. As he sat in his attic that night, looking at the rain-streaked window, Ethan did not feel the sting of the gala's shove. He felt the immense, quiet power of a man who knows that tomorrow the invisible man would be the only one left standing in the light. He opened his laptop, the glow illuminating the hundreds of folders labeled original schematics, and prepared the final file. The time for the secret to speak was only hours away. The morning after the gala, the city's newspapers were plastered with the image of Julian standing triumphantly in front of the Wall of Honor. The headlines hailed him as the architect of the decade. But Ethan viewed the digital editions from a cracked smartphone screen while sitting in a small, nondescript diner. He was not looking at the praise, he was looking at the technical errors in Julian's quoted interview. Julian had described the central atrium's ventilation as a static aesthetic choice, completely oblivious to the fact that it was a thermodynamic masterpiece designed to reduce energy costs by 40%. The secret was no longer just a legal document. It was a fundamental gap in reality. Julian owned the image, but Ethan owned the soul of the machine. Ethan reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a single, cream-colored envelope. It was not a subpoena or a threatening lawyer's letter. It was a formal invitation to a private breakfast at the Sterling estate. Mr. Sterling, the reclusive billionaire whose family had built half the city's skyline, was the primary financier of the Evergreen Project. Sterling was a man of old-world values. He believed in the master builder tradition, where the man who drew the line was the man who understood the stone. He had reached out to Ethan weeks ago after noticing a discrepancy in the computer-aided design files. The metadata on the most brilliant architectural innovations did not lead back to Julian's high-tech workstation. They led back to a legacy version of software, registered to an E. Thorn in a low-rent zip code. The drive to the Sterling estate was a transition into a world of quiet power. Unlike Julian's flashy penthouse, Sterling's home was built with timeless materials: granite, oak, and light. When Ethan was ushered into the glass-walled sunroom, Mr. Sterling did not look at his scuffed shoes or his unbranded blazer. He looked at Ethan's eyes. A man who builds for the poor usually does not show up to galas in a $5,000 suit, Sterling remarked, gesturing for Ethan to sit. But a man who steals a vision usually does. Tell me, Ethan, why have you not screamed from the rooftops that Julian is a fraud? Ethan took a breath, the plan finally taking shape in his words. Because a building built on a scream will not stand, Mr. Sterling. I did not want to stop the project. I wanted to save it. If I had exposed Julian a year ago, the investors would have panicked. The permits would have been pulled, and 1,000 families would still be living in condemned slums. I waited until the foundation was poured. I waited until the truth was the only thing left that could keep the lights on. Ethan laid the flash drive on the table between them. Julian signed the final construction phase contracts yesterday morning before the gala. He was so distracted by the cameras that he did not notice the clause regarding the proprietary structural integrity patents. He thinks he bought the rights. He actually only bought a license to use them, a license that expires the moment the creator is dismissed without cause from the project. Mr. Sterling leaned back, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips. He understood the poetic justice Ethan had engineered. It was not about a messy public scandal. It was about a mathematical certainty. By shoving Ethan out of the photo and treating him as catering staff, Julian had effectively publicly documented his own ignorance of Ethan's role. He had created a narrative where Ethan did not exist, which meant Ethan's unsolicited inventions remained legally untethered to the firm. The gala was the final test, Ethan continued quietly. I needed to know if Julian had even a shred of respect for the craft. He does not. He sees the Evergreen Project as a trophy. I see it as a trust. The plan was simple, but devastating. That afternoon, during the official key handover ceremony at the construction site, Mr. Sterling would ask Julian a series of technical questions in front of the board of directors and the press. He would ask for the encryption keys to the automated climate systems, keys that were tied to Ethan's private server. He would ask for the structural stress test logs that Julian had never seen. Julian would reach for his invisible man to provide the answers, but for the first time in 3 years, the invisible man would not be there to catch him.